Welcome back. Returning to the tariffs and market turmoil and the UK's options as the government tries to secure a US trade deal now. Let's speak to Shanker Singham, the chief executive of the consultancy firm Competere. He's worked as a senior trade advisor in government also. Welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. First of all, first question really, can you see any economic wisdom in what President Trump has done regarding tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's been a lot of criticism of this, but I think actually President Trump is not wrong to focus on some of these what he calls non-monetary issues. So essentially, these are behind-the-border regulatory barriers and distortions and lack of protection of intellectual property rights and so forth. The document he waved around, the book that was about a 400-page book, is called the National Trade Estimate. It's done by a US Trade Representative every year, has been done for 40 years. And actually, if you do look at that, you find that on those sides of things, the regulatory issues and the protection of property rights and IP and that kind of thing, that very little progress has been made. I mean, US companies have been complaining about this for decades. So I think he's not wrong to focus on that. This is a huge realignment of trade policy. It's a sort of once in a century kind of approach. He's basically saying, look, what we've tried in the past has failed. US exporters continue to be damaged. We need to do something different. And that's why he's imposed this huge tariff on a number of countries, although the UK has not been hit with some of the bigger tariffs that we've seen. They've been hit by 10%, which is damaging. I mean, it's going to be a big impact on the UK economy, but it could have been considerably worse, I think, and has been for many countries.
It sounds like you think he has a point when it comes to traditional trade and really banishing that.
Yeah, I think definitely. If you look at the history of the attempts to deal with these behind the border barriers, it's one thing to have the tariff go down, but if you don't then have market access and contestability into the market, you can't succeed in the market, which is the complaint of a number of US exporters. Then you have to do something different. And carrying on the way we were going, I think he would argue, just continues to damage US industry unnecessarily, and we need to try something different. So, I think if you look at the modeling that we've done, for example, of these behind the border measures and the distortions and the regulatory barriers, and you compare them with the more conventional trade measures, you actually find that the impact of these behind the border measures is much bigger. So basically, what he's saying is, look, we spent the last 80 years of the trade system focusing on one thing, which is tariff reduction. That's actually a very small part of the overall impact on countries of these kinds of overall barriers. And we've forgotten about the lion's share of these things. So unless countries are going to change their ways and improve, reduce those barriers, I'm going to hit you with a really high tariff. So that's basically what they've done. And if countries want to remove those tariffs, those US tariffs that they face, the first thing to do is to pick up that 400-page book and look at your entry, look at what the National Trade Estimate says about complaints that US companies and US exporters have, and see how much of that you can actually improve. And I think a lot of countries are doing that exercise now. Interestingly, just now, Vietnam has said, and they got a very high tariff because there's a lot of China circumvention that goes through Vietnam. And they basically said, look, we're prepared to bring our tariffs to zero across the board to US exports. And the reaction of the administration has been, okay, that's fine, but you have a range of other barriers and a range of other regulatory distortions and so on. And unless you fix those, your tariff reductions are pretty meaningless. So.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in to ask about the fight back. What about the fight back and internationally, and specifically in the case of the UK? Is retaliation inevitable?
So I think if you're a very big market like the EU or China, then perhaps there's a better argument for retaliation. But you've got to ask yourself, what is the purpose of retaliation? Because generally, when this is done, and retaliatory tariffs are used in the trading system when there's a violation of a trade agreement. retaliatory tariffs are used, but they are used in order to force members of Congress, in particular congressional districts, to lobby the president to change what he's done. So that's why these retaliatory tariffs are always in things like bourbon and Harley Davidson motorcycles and Levi jeans and this sort of thing, in the hope that members of Congress in those affected districts will do that. Now, it's very unlikely they're going to do that at this stage in the presidency. Perhaps as we get closer to the midterm elections, especially if US consumers are starting to feel some inflationary pressure and so on, then they might actually start to think in those ways, but they're not going to do it now. So the retaliatory tariff is just damaging your own consumers. And I think a country like the UK, where it's unlikely that sort of effect will bring, President Trump to the negotiating table, that's probably not the right way to go. And in fact, his history on countries that have said they're going to retaliate is to even increase the tariffs that he's imposing. So I think the approach that the UK government is taking is the right approach, which is, let's see what we can do to lower our overall level of trade barriers, behind the border measures, all of these things. And we certainly want to have a deal with the US, which lowers that tariff from 10% to zero, lowers the car tariff from 25% to zero. And I think there's definitely in the Trump administration, there is a market for that. They're predisposed to do something like that. And as time goes on, I think they will have to have some wins. They'll have to have some evidence that this massive change, this massive realignment is causing some effect, other than
Okay.
the retaliation and so forth, which is damaging the global economy.
Very interesting, Shanker Singham. Thank you for your analysis there, Chief Executive of the consultancy firm Competere. Thank you.
Thank you.